Good evening, everyone. If you could please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Board of Estimate and Taxation for January 2010. As you all know, because you're here, our meeting is starting an hour early tonight than usual. Tonight we have a presentation to start off our meeting by the Health Dimensions Group before we even get to our routine applications. With us tonight from Health Dimensions Group is Tom Stitt and Mary Nell Zellner, who we've been working with for the past 5 months or so in review of Nathaniel Witherell's long-range plan, otherwise known as Project Renew. Also in the audience tonight, it looks like almost the entire board. I had on my calendar that Nathaniel Witherell had a board meeting tonight. I guess you're having it here. But thank you for coming. And I do know that at some point, Chairman of the Nathaniel Witherell Board, David Ormsby, would like to speak as well on this important topic for the town. So if you're not here for Nathaniel Witherell, sit tight. We'll be with you in a little while. I suspect that our presentation and questions and answers will last approximately about an hour or so. As I said, this is an important topic for the town, and I want to make sure that people's viewpoints, the questions of the BET members are taken into consideration, and that we allow for enough vetting of the process. And just so it's crystal clear, this report that's generated tonight is not the final report. Part of the process is for this conversation to take place, and then ultimately for a final report to be generated at some later date, depending on the conversation. I'd also like to comment that before HDG does make its presentation, that as everyone knows, this has been a process, a very lengthy process for the town. And tonight, not only are we looking at the long-range plan, but I'd like for especially BET members to keep in mind that we really have 4 choices here. And as I like to say, on a more personal note, 2 of them aren't really that great of choices. And that is supporting Project Renew as presented, maybe refining it slightly, but essentially approving it as presented. Having the town not be in the nursing home business, simply renovating Nathaniel Witherell, which I believe we've looked at, I can probably count at least 2 times, if not more than that, over the recent past. And by all accounts, that's not necessarily a viable option because of the private pay situation. And then redefining Project Renew, which I'm not sure where that constructive criticism would come from, but that's certainly an option. And so in the context of the presentation, I'd like BET members to focus on that, because at some point later on in this calendar year, we're going to be asked to fund Project Renew. And so I'd rather have those, if you have issues, present them here tonight so that not only Nathaniel Witherell but the public can start talking about some of these issues, so that when the funding request comes in, that in fact you have all of your answers or answers to your questions, and that we can move forward at least on a consensus about where we're headed with Project Renew and Nathaniel Witherell. And so that's my goal tonight, is to try to get us closer to that step than farther away. And so with that, let me turn it over to Tom and to Mary Nell and have at it.
Thanks, Steve. Just to introduce, my name is Tom Stitt. I'm the Director of Financial Analysis and Reimbursement at Health Dimensions. And this is Mary Nell Zellner, who's Senior Vice President of Consulting at Health Dimensions. The report that we've provided is about 90 pages long, and we don't have time to go through every page. So we're going to skip through some slides and hit on the highlights of our findings and the recommendations or findings that have a material impact on the financials. Just to give you an idea, we've done we've used a 6-phase approach on this. You can, and we're going to talk about the scope of our project, and then the 6 phases that we looked at are the construction costs, the revenues, we did an operational and clinical on-site assessment. We looked at the projected expenses and then the cost of capital. And finally, phase 6 is looking at the impact of any recommendations that we make on the long-range plan. The scope of the project, you can move to the next slide. Again, we were engaged to review the 30-year financial projections contained in the LRP. With the mission is to verify the projected revenues and expenses within that plan. And in doing so, we looked at the census assumptions, the revenue assumptions and reimbursement rates, all of the salary and non-salary expenses, construction costs, and debt service. So the first phase was the construction budget assessment. And what we did here, we performed a review of the construction budgets, phasing plans, and project schedules that were provided by Turner, as well as the drawings that were made available to us back in October. The review was a high-level review, and what we did, we provided some commentary as to the reasonableness of those estimates, and then also the reasonableness of the construction timetable. Again, this was a high-level review. We didn't get into the details, but the results of the review was that our construction consultant, who's not here today, but their review, they determined that their estimate of the project cost based on the documents and drawings was about $29.69 million. This is about $7.8 million below the estimate provided by Turner, and then $7.2 million below what's included in the LRP. We are it's our understanding that the $36.883 million is the number that's been agreed upon for the project. The variance, the $7.8 million variance, falls into four main categories that you can see here, and it's our opinion that there may be some opportunity for savings within this budget. Now, there's some things that we may not be aware of as far as local market conditions in Greenwich, so that may be a reason for some of the variance between our review and the ones provided by Turner. The construction timeline appeared to be reasonable. And they didn't see that there being any issue completing the project within that timeline. Again, if we did a more detailed analysis of the construction costs and all of the plans and documents behind it, it may change some of our findings, but without doing that, we're not sure. So at this time, we're recommending no changes to the amounts included in the LRP related to the construction costs. The next section, phase 2, was looking at the projected revenues. And the scope is just looking at all of the assumptions and calculations, market analysis, occupancy payer mix, reimbursement rate, and inflation factors. Our focus, we're going to focus on the reimbursement rates and the Medicaid rate calculations and inflation factors in this meeting, because those were the ones where we saw some material variances. So what we're going to do now is skip to slide 12. Actually, I do want to touch on one thing in the occupancy projections. For the most part, we thought that the occupancy and payer mix assumptions were reasonable. The one key item here is that during the construction period, it's assumed that the average daily census will only drop by 2. This is a very, very important assumption. It's been our experience in the past that during construction projects, you see a dip in census, between 15 to 20%. But since Project Renew is a unique project over 9 phases with the goal of providing minimal disruption to the census and operations, we believe that based on this plan that's achievable. However, that it's achievable if the project is very carefully managed, and that is a key assumption, because if there is a dip in census during that time frame, it could result in a material drop in cash flow and net income. Now we'd like to skip forward to slide 21. In the revenue projections, the 2 key items in our review were the Medicaid reimbursement assumptions and the Medicare reimbursement assumptions. Medicaid, the current average daily rate or current rate is $243.42. That's based on the most recent rate letter provided by the state, which is favorable compared to other facilities in the state. The range is $125 to $270. Now, in the LRP, there is a 0% inflation rate that is included, which is consistent with the state of Connecticut budgets. They have a rate freeze in effect through 2011. So the inflation factors used within the model, I believe, are reasonable. If you go to slide 23, the key part of the Medicaid rate is what's called the fair rental value. The state of Connecticut uses the fair rental value allowance system to reimburse providers for property cost. The FRV is designed to account for depreciation and interest costs. It's used in lieu of depreciation and interest. And you calculate it by amortizing the base value of the property over the useful life with a rate of return assumption that's set by the state. The rate of return is linked to a borrowing rate, and it does fluctuate each year. In 2009, it was 4.515%. So the fair rental value calculation is not subject to any limits on rate increases that the state provides. The LRP that we reviewed had an increase of $26.19 to account for those for the fair rental value. Our first finding was that this calculation was not consistent with the formula that the state of Connecticut uses. The first thing we did was recalculate the FRV using the state published formula at various levels of cost approval. The state, if the state has approved 100% of the project cost to be used in this formula, the rate would be $35.60. 75% would be $26.70, and 65% would be $23.14. We have used in our revised projections the 65% approved amount, which is $23.14. This final rate is going to depend on how the negotiations go with the state. When we did a review of the CON that was done 4 or 5 years ago, the state had approved $25 million out of the proposed $41 million construction budget. So the state may not grant 100% of the costs. And there's various things that they look at. They look at whether or not, or they may think the costs are excessive. And they also looked at what specifically you're doing to improve the facility. If it's related to services such as rehab, they may or may not allow a portion of those costs that are related to rehab, since rehab is mainly a Medicare and commercial service. So that's the little background on how the state looks at those at the projects. Currently, Nathaniel Witherell's reimbursement for fair rental value is $6.05. The actual cost is $4.62. Currently getting a $1.43% bump up because there's a minimum rate that the state pays facilities. And currently that rate is $6.05. So if you fall below that, you get that amount. So after the review of the Medicaid rate, we're recommending the following changes to the LRP. Correct the fair rental value calculation to reflect the formula published by the state. Calculate that fair rental value using 65% of the total cost, which comes out to $24.7 million, which is what the state had approved previously 4 or 5 years ago. And then reduce that calculated amount by the difference between the current minimum fair rent threshold and the actual current capital cost. So the impact of this calculation is a reduction of cash flow over 30 years of approximately $5.4 million. So that is the first of two key revenue assumptions. The second is Medicare Part A. And this changed up until about a week ago. This was considered basically a slam dunk. There's pending healthcare reform legislation that includes significant reductions over 10 years. The first thing they talked about was eliminating the existing the 2.2% market basket increase that went into effect in October. That would result in a $15 per day increase for the rest of fiscal year 10. The second key point is the implementation of productivity adjustments to the annual market basket increase. This would be done over the next 10 years, and the thinking is that it would be around a 1% decrease, a reduction to the market basket. There's also plans that are going to happen. Well, those changes in healthcare reform, those are in the House and Senate bills. And as we know, after the election in Massachusetts, the future of those bills is uncertain. But CMS does not need this to be part of legislation to make those adjustments. So they still may happen, and they have been talked about over the last couple of years. But with healthcare reform, you're really going to have to follow this closely over the next several months to see how it plays out. CMS will be revising or implementing a revised case mix classification methodology next year. And MedPAC, who has a say, or they have their annual opinion on what CMS should do as far as rate increases. They have recommended a 0% market basket increase for next year, fiscal year 2011. So currently, the LRP has a fiscal year 2010 rate of 483.61, which is based on the RUG rates that were from last year. But then the LRP also assumes a 3% annual inflation factor beginning in 2011 through the life of the model. And with the changes proposed by MedPAC and the healthcare reform bills, we recommend that a more conservative approach be taken on these inflation factors, and 0% for 2011, with 1.5% from 2012 through 2015, and then 2% through 2019, which gives us a 10-year period. The impact of this is substantial. It reduces the cash flow within the LRP by $25.4 million over the 30-year period. If we can move to slide 34, please. The other assumption that we made in the revenue section, in order to compare what the impact is on the financial projections, we thought that we recommended removing the fundraising assumptions that were included within the projections. There was about $12 million over the life of the 30-year model. So what we did was we took that out of the model so that we could really get an understanding of what the gap is, or what the gap will be for the 30-year projections to work, and whether or not and that gap would be filled by fundraising or some other source. So we'll see how that factors in at the end. And Mary, now you want to talk about...
Sure. The next slide we're going to hop to is number 36. And this is part of our team conducted an on-site assessment late October of last year, looking at both operational and clinical aspects of Nathaniel Witherell. And so the core elements we looked at were existing clinical staffing and the model going forward to a different community household type model of specifically in the clinical staffing. We did a Medicare audit looking at the documentation and the reimbursement being documented and realized at the current in the current system, and then also did high-level clinical interviews with operational staff and lead staff at the facility, and then benchmark that data. So we'll move forward to slide number 38, which is kind of where some more impact areas were. We looked at the pre-admission process and looked for opportunities within the current operation to maximize Medicare reimbursement. That's a key factor for all skilled nursing facilities to weather reimbursement issues coming forward. Of our 7 chart audits that were completed, 5 of them had revenue being left on the table, and the 3 bullets underneath bullet number 2 were issues related to lack of pre-screening, not looking back at hospital data to capture IV use, and also not capturing all the activities of daily living coding. And these are all clinical aspects within getting your RUG score accurately assessed. So of those 7 charts reviewed, 5 of them had $6,500 being left. And that when we looked specifically at 14-day stays, so short stay Medicare people. Right after that conversation and that assessment, the facility engaged an outside service by the name of Dart Chart to help educate and impact its coding and assessment. So, and there was an estimate from their leadership staff that approximately $340,000 could be realized through a more global documentation review and process improvement, and that's already been has been impacting the facility because they've engaged in that contract. The next area we looked at, that's in terms of impacting Medicare. There is opportunity. One of our assessment key pieces related to Medicare was that there is a great opportunity to impact Medicare reimbursement. Training and monitoring would be critical, not just having the DART training, but the ongoing auditing to make sure that their staff is taking actionable efforts to improve. And then also, obviously, with the Medicare reimbursement looming in decline, that maximizing coding and documentation will be critical. So one of our key recommendations here is that a more detailed, and ours was a snapshot, again, a high-level review, but that a more detailed documentation review of Medicare and training be performed by an outside consultant to make sure that those revenues are being enhanced and maximized. I'll move forward through the other data. The benchmark data is all there for your reading pleasure. I will move forward through till slide 46 and get back into the verification of the expenses.
Yeah, on slide 47, our scope when it came to the expenses is to look at all the expense assumptions related to direct care costs, support costs, non-payroll costs, town expense allocations, capital expenditures, and the inflation factors behind those. If we look at slide 49, please. The key issue in the expense section is around the salary expenses. The LRP, the 2009 expenses total 11.21 million. The LRP includes a slight reduction for the projected fiscal year 2010. There's a wage freeze currently in effect, and no change in staffing levels. And then there was another bonus reduction that was factored in. And then the LRP also assumes an increase in salaries of $155,000 annually, phased in over 3 years, beginning in 2011, to incorporate a new staffing model as a result of the renovations. And then the other key assumption is that throughout the life of the model, beginning in 2011, the LRP includes an annual inflation factor on salaries of 3.5%. You know, with the ongoing Medicaid rate freezes and the Medicare reimbursement cuts that are in the near future, it will be difficult to sustain the break-even financial performance with a salary inflation factor that exceeds the revenue stream. So I think our assumption, we believe that assumption is too conservative and should be modified to reflect a more realistic scenario in which salary increases are based on the rate of increase in net revenue. So what we've done is recommended adjusting the LRP to show a salary inflation rate that's equal to the rate of increase in net patient revenues, with a floor of 2% and a ceiling of 3.5%. This would allow for controlling expenses during times when there's reimbursement cuts. The impact of this recommendation is an increase in the cash flow of approximately $38.5 million over the 30-year life of the model. The second factor in the salary expenses is we did an analysis of the impact of changes to this new staffing model that was proposed. The proposed model adds approximately 5 FTEs to the current FTE count of 208. And based on our analysis, the estimated impact would be an increase in annual salaries of $317,000 compared to the increase of $155 that's already included in the LRP. So we've recommended adjusting the LRP to increase the salaries by that additional $162,000, and to start that increase in fiscal year 2014 after the renovations are complete. So the impact of this is a reduction in cash flow of approximately $6.1 million over 30 years. Now, if we can just fast forward, those were the other. Fast forward to slide 69, please. The other key expense assumptions that are impacted are the employee benefits that are adjusted along with the salary expenses. As your salaries go up or down, the benefits are adjusted accordingly as well. And looking at phase 5, we are looking at the cost of capital for the model. And if we move to slide 71, the model includes financing for the construction costs of $36.883 million, but it does not. It's not clear how cash deficits related to operations would be funded throughout the 30-year model. The LRP, before any adjustments were made, showed a positive cash flow of $12.1 million over the 30-year period. However, from fiscal year 2018 through 2033, there were cash deficits each year, with the low point of $5.9 million in fiscal year 2027. The LRP also assumes $12.3 million in private donations and as I mentioned earlier, but this is not enough to offset that $5.9 million deficit. So the original LRP would require additional capital through either private donations, town subsidy, or some other source. So those are the key findings from our first 5 phases. If we move on to slide 73, again, to revisit, I've mentioned the impacts of these as we've gone along, but just to summarize the impact, the first thing that we did was calculate a baseline. You can move to slide 75, please. The first thing we did was to calculate a baseline from the original LRP. Then we eliminated the fundraising line to show what the original gap is. After that, the revised, so we called that our revised baseline, which shows a cash flow over the 30-year period of negative $157,000, which is on the 4th column in this table. And then the far right column shows what the total cash need for the life of the project to avoid any cash deficits is. And in this case, it's $14.9 million is our total cash need. The next step is calculate the impact of each of the recommended changes that we have addressed in this report. And you can see the list of recommendations, the significant ones we've addressed during this meeting, such as the Medicaid rate, Medicare rate, and the salary adjustments. So the bottom line is what the LRP would look like with all of our recommended changes included. And in this case, the net cash flow over the 30-year period, column 4, is a negative $5.1 million. And the total cash need for the project is $21.3 million. On the next slide, we then proceeded to perform some sensitivity analyses on a couple of the key topics. The first of which is salary inflation factors. We did 4 scenarios. One with the 3.5% annual increase, which is the LRP as is. Scenario 2 is an increase that reflects the net patient revenue increase plus 1%. Scenario 3 is inflation factor that's equal to the revenue increase. And scenario 4 is the inflation factor equal to the revenue increase with a 2% floor and a 3.5% max, which is what we ultimately included in the recommended changes. So to show the results, this table shows the net impact of each of those scenarios on the 30-year cumulative cash flow, and then it shows what the total cash requirement to fund the project deficit would be using these scenarios. So scenario 1, the original LRP, obviously it would have no impact because it's the same as what the original LRP is, but the total cash need of using this scenario is $44 million. Scenario 2 would result in a $41 million reduction in cash flow and a total cash need of $85 million. Scenario 3 would result in an increase in cash flow over the original projection of $47.2 million and result in a total cash need of $15.7 million. And then scenario 4 would result in a $38.5 million increase in cash flow and a $21.3 million total cash requirement. So that just shows you the impact of those 4 scenarios. The second thing we did was look at a sensitivity analyses on the Medicaid fair rental value calculation. And using the 4 levels of approved project costs that we talked about earlier, 100%, 75%, 65%, and 50%. In this case, same same setup in this table. Scenario 1 would result in a $6.8 million increase in cash flow and a $13.5 million cash requirement. Scenario 2 would result in a $1.9 million reduction of cash flow and an $19 million cash need. And scenario 3 is a $5.3 million reduction of cash flow and a $21.3 million cash need, which is what we have included in the revised model. And then scenario 4, if they only approved 50%, it would reduce cash flow by $10.5 million and result in a total cash need of $25 million. We did address a few of the opportunities that we noted along the way, one being the construction costs, the second being increased Medicare reimbursement through improved coding and documentation, additional revenue provided by the pavilion. There were we did a comparison of costs to the industry benchmarks, and there were a couple of categories where there may be an opportunity to improve. And then the reduced model of care training costs. These are opportunities for improved financial performance over the years that we have not factored into the projections. But as an example, the Medicare reimbursement one would help greatly offset some of the impact of the proposed reimbursement reductions. So to conclude, the current long-range projection shows a negative cash flow of $157,000 and a $4.9 million cash requirement. The changes that we've proposed in the report result in a $4.9 million reduction in cash flow and an additional $6.4 million in cash requirement. So the revised projections have a total cash flow of negative $5.1 million and a total cash requirement of $21.3 million. That $21.3 million applies to an 18-year period beginning in 2013 through 2030, and it's mainly related to the debt service, the proposed debt service on the construction costs. So any fundraising efforts or other cash subsidies would be focused during this time frame. And again, if the $21.3 million is not generated through private donations, then some other source of funding would be required. So that completes kind of the highlights of our report. Steve, you want to, I don't know how to proceed. Should we have questions or?
I think now it's an opportunity for board members who've had this report. There were 4 of us who worked with HDG, myself, Larry Simon, Leslie Tarkington, and Jeff Raymer, so I want to thank them for their work in assisting HDG, as well as Nathaniel Witherell and most notably Lloyd Bankson and Dave Ormsby, who were there sort of every step of the way. And I know your staff behind the scenes was also assisting HDG in their reporting, and of course our finance department, who also assisted on a routine basis, and the Comptroller, Peter Mynarski. So at this point, why don't we open it up to questions once again, trying to keep the questions on a constructive basis to understand the report better, but also as I see this as really the first step for moving HDG along over the coming months to finally get to the point where we're looking at Project Renew in the sense of whether or not we're committing construction funds for that. So taking that first step, why don't we start with Jeff Raymer?
Yeah, if I could direct your attention back to page 75, I'd like to be sure that I understand some of the figures, some of the columns that you have there. First, I want to understand the difference, if I can, between the third column, net income, and the fourth column, cash flow. Is the difference there the cash effect of paying back the principal and debt service on the borrowings?
Yes.
So you're assuming that the payback is approximately $52 million in round numbers?
$52 million. How did you get that?
It's the arithmetic difference. I'm sorry. I'm using your revised baseline,
Yes.
which is $51,700 something thousand dollars, plus the net negative at the end, 156. So it comes to $51,860 some odd thousand dollars.
Yes. Well, okay. Yes. In addition, there is a $14.9 million cash requirement to fund cash deficits during that time frame. So I believe the number that you are looking for is 51.7 million plus 14.9,
Which is
would
the
be the
last
net
column.
income plus the cash required to eliminate any negative cash situations.
I'd also be grateful for your help understanding the last column, the fifth column, the total cash need. The figures in that column, that's an accumulating total of the demands upon the town or some other source to fund the net negative funding year to year to year during the period you were talking about, 2018 to 2033.
That's correct.
And elsewhere in the report, you indicated that the highest single year's demand would be about 5.9 million?
Yes, in the original model prior to any recommended changes, yes.
But if I understand you correctly, also, at the end of the full 30-year run, however, the full amount of this total cash need will in fact have been almost entirely paid back. The net negative at the end is the $157,000 more or less that I'm seeing in the fourth column.
Yes, you need to have an influx of cash during the middle of that model to avoid any negative cash situations and before the facility can self-sustain itself and generate positive cash flow. So in the last 10 years of the model, it's generating positive cash flow and requires no infusion of private donations or subsidy or whatever.
And by the end of the 30 years, it's practically fully paid itself back, all except for the $157,000.
Yes, I think that assumption can be made. I would have to go back and verify that in my model, but.
All right. One more question, if I can. Back on page 50, the chairman will tell me if I'm demanding too much time here, but back on page 50, you focused on an assumption you were going to be using for the experience of the salary increases. And if I understood your third bullet point on page 50, I think you're saying that this model, your model, I should say, your revision to the model, has been predicated upon assumption that the salary increases we're likely to experience will be equivalent to the rate increases, except the salary increases will be, for your assumption, never less than 2% nor more than 3.5%.
That's correct.
Is it your opinion, I'm sorry, you've been acting as a consultant in this industry for some period of time. I mean, it's an industry in which you have some depth of experience.
Yes, yes.
Is it your considered opinion that this scenario is in fact the most likely scenario? I recognize it's difficult to look 30 years into the future, but consistent with that difficulty, is it fair to say that it's your considered opinion that this scenario is the most likely of the various scenarios you've talked about?
It's my opinion that to have a facility that is self-sustaining, you need to have expenses. You need to control expenses to the extent that your revenues are, to the revenue that you're generating. And, you know, if we own or manage 25 facilities throughout the country. And, you know, that's one thing that we do is when we're creating our budgets is the salaries and benefits are reflective of what our revenue stream is going to generate, because we need to have at least a break-even performance from those facilities. So that is the basis of my assumption on the salary inflation factors, that they are consistent with the increase in our revenue stream.
I don't mean to squeeze you, but there's a piece where the question isn't quite being answered.
Okay.
The question that I put to you really is, maybe we should do this differently. If you take a look at page 76, you laid out 4 scenarios. In those 4 scenarios, and these were hypotheticals, if I understand it, for the sake of doing arithmetic to get a sense of how different scenarios affect the figures. In scenario number 1, you proposed, gee, what would happen if, as the long-range plan proposed by Nathaniel Witherell had put forward, what would happen if salaries went up by 3.5% every year after these first 3 years? Scenario number 2 was, what happens if salaries go up equivalent to rate increases, but they run a little behind, so that our rate increases are actually 1% behind the salary increases we're extending? Scenario 3 was, let's just assume that we have rate increases that match salary increases year to year. It doesn't matter what they are. There's no caps, there's no collars, they just match.
Yes.
And scenario number 4, if I understood it, was, yes, they're matched, but we're going to put the salary increases within a collar, and the collar will be the salary increases will never be less than 2%, nor more than 3.5%. And on the next page, 76, you have the dollar effect of that, and there's quite a remarkable swing on the dollars. And that leads me to go back to page 50 and say, when you propose, for the sake of this analysis, that salary increases will match rate increases, except salary increases will always be between 2% and 3.5%, is that, in fact, in your considered opinion, the most likely scenario that we're likely to experience?
Well, and what we tried to present was a reasonable scenario. And as far as the likely scenario, it really depends on how the town is able to, or how Witherell is able to negotiate with unions and so forth. And of the 4 scenarios that were presented, I picked the scenario that we thought was most reasonable, whereby we put a floor so that salaries will not increase less than a 2% floor, and then have the 3.5% as the ceiling, which is what was proposed in the original LRP.
So you think that's the most reasonable of the scenarios?
I think it's the most it's the most reasonable of scenarios to project forward, to have if the facility, if you want to have a facility that is self-sustaining, that was our opinion of the most reasonable scenario to achieve that, considering the reimbursement cuts that are coming through. Having a 3.5% increase when your reimbursement is increasing by 1.5% increase, 1.5%, to us did not seem like a very logical scenario.
I'll ask one more question. In the 25 facilities that you own and or operate, are you, generally speaking, achieving scenario number 4 in your relationship between revenues and salaries?
It vacillates. It really depends on the negotiating year. But there have been years where there are complete freezes, depending on the states and where we're located. We're located in numerous states. There have been freezes across the board, salary. There's never been a reduction in salary.
I'll bet.
But there have been freezes. And there have been multiple year freezes, depending on the state budgets. So that some states, but it's all based on the negotiation of your contracts or your labor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, if you, sure, hold on.
Okay.
If you feel like you're in a deposition, you are, as you can tell. There are a bunch
That's
of
fine.
attorneys.
That's fine. I appreciate it.
So,
I hope I can answer.
Just wait till we get to Mr. Kelly. In fact, I think he just came off trial, so we'll see.
I don't mind.
But with that, Mr. Pellegrino.
The 25 facilities that you refer to, are you subject to union contracts? All of them? What
Not all.
percentage?
Probably 70.
70%. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Huffman.
Are any of your facilities located in Connecticut, in the Northeast?
Mr. Campbell.
I just had a question on the construction period, and I think your materials and the way you read it tonight, you sort of briefly expressed a concern. Your experience has been that the count goes down as much as 15 to 20% on average. Projections here are just a 5% drop. You have concerns, but you think maybe we can do it, so you left those numbers untouched. I just think maybe if you'd give us a little more background on why you think we can achieve that.
Yeah, it was really in looking at the 9-phase approach that was designed, and how it was explained by the Nathaniel Wetherell employees and board members and the construction contractor, that gave us a comfort level that this could be achieved if tightly managed and carefully managed.
So just one follow-up. So could I say then you're suggesting that it's likely that it would be achieved? Could be doesn't give me as much assurance as it's likely to be achieved.
Yes, if tightly managed, likely to be achieved. Yes.
Mr. Finger.
You've explained to us that in years 2018 through 2033, those are the years where the cash deficits will occur. And during that period of time, I think you indicated that in the LRP projections, $5.9 million would be the highest amount deficit in one particular year. Is that correct?
Yes, in the original projections, 5.9 million.
In the projections using your scenarios and your recommendations, what would that number change to?
I don't know if I have. Did we? It's not
Okay,
on my
that's
table.
okay.
I'll have to follow up and get that number to you.
It would be helpful if you can make that available to us, as well as show us the projections that include those particular years, 2018 through 2033, because we do our own projections and modeling 10 years out. So to be able to match those deficits with what our projections are would be helpful for me, because obviously if they have, if we take the $5.9 million cash deficit, that money has to come from somewhere, whether it's from the taxpayers or private donations. At this point we don't know, but it has to be met by somebody.
Okay, I'll have to. I'll get that number to you.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill, just so I'm clear about what's being asked, because this is the first statement and follow-up by a question in terms of what it is that we're seeking as a board. You're looking for a cash flow statement for the entire length of the project?
Yes, yes, I am.
And I think
both on the LRP, using those assumption scenarios, and your revised.
I think I can answer your question now after looking at my presentation here. On slide 81, where I have the conclusions, the last point there, 21.3 million, that does represent the low point of cash balance throughout the life of the model.
No,
Not a single year's.
That I understand.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the particular years.
Okay, I'll get that information.
Thank you.
Mr. Bankson?
In our projections, the worst year we have is a deficit of 1.4 in 1 year, just to be clear.
Then maybe I misunderstood.
The 5.9 is the lowest point of the accumulated cash deficit.
Thank you for explaining that. I'd still like to see the cash flow.
Oh, so
Yeah.
most of 1 year is
Thank you.
1.4.
Under the Nathaniel Wetherell long-range plan, but I think what Mr. Finger is asking for, and I think other people on the board would like to see, is under the revised HDG model, a cash flow, not on total amount of that's needed, but that year
Right.
amount that's needed for each
I'd
and
like to
every
see
year
it for
going
both.
forward.
We're going to
Project it out on a 30, actually, might as well do the 30 years. Each year, what the deficit or the surplus might be.
We're going to provide the detailed Excel model with our final report, so you can see the 30-year cash flow income
Yeah,
statement.
thank you. That would be helpful.
Mr. Mason?
I'd like to, two things. I'd like to go back to where Mr. Campbell was about construction time frame, because you're projecting 29 or 30 months. And if possible, when you get back to us in the next stage, is to quantify a cost if we were down 10, 15, 20%. The other thing I'd like to see is, I'd like to see where we are today, where we're going with this project. You have a group of assumptions in here, and in that assumption, your revenues are broken up from Medicare, Medicaid, rehab, and self-pay. And my first question is, did you use a constant model the whole way through, or did that change? There's a business plan that this is built off of, correct? Mm-hmm. It's been what I call a running business plan, but we have a business plan that this is built off. And when we get back, I'd like to see where it changes from what we have now, Medicaid, Medicare, rehab revenues versus self-pay revenues, and see where that changes going forward.
Are you referring to the payer mix and
Yeah,
where we hit stabilized under with the new facility?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's going to be very important. I think there's always been a conversation about town about the number of total beds versus this seems to be a lower number of beds, but yet more programs. So just if we can, when we get to that point, to be able to see it at least flow consistently.
Okay, and within the body of the report, I didn't address those issues because they didn't turn out to be material findings. We didn't make any material adjustments to that, but I did address those within the occupancy payer mix section of the report. And then on the Excel model, you'll be able to see actual numbers.
Mr. Kelly?
Mike picked up on what I wanted, the underlying business plan and the pairings, which was a concern to me, because this whole thing is on assumptions of Medicare, Medicaid going forward, which is also based on politicians, right? So, I mean, all throughout this 80-page report, I see assumption, 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 Medicare reimbursement, Medicaid. Now, you obviously have built a business on these assumptions with 25 nursing homes. Here we have a town of Greenwich in this business. And I think, and I don't know that this is our province right now, this is something we're supposed to discuss or get into, but it's, I was happy to see that the coding, somebody was brought in and we dealt with that right away. I'm looking at the benchmarks that are laid out in the back of the document, and I see some of the, variance in there that's of concern to me. And I don't know if that's going to be a larger discussion that we're going to have as to, do we go forward with this? And if we go forward with this construction, is this something we should be doing? Is this something a professional should be doing? Now, I know the RTM has already taken a vote on this a year or two ago. Originally, they said it should be privately run, and there were some concerns. Then it switched and said it should be town-run. Now, are we going to take that up, or are we just going to make the assumption that we are going forward with a town-run operation? And this is something I'd like Mr. Ormsby to address at some point with your permission, because I think I'd like to hear a response on that. Because I'm somewhat troubled by all the assumptions and the responsibility that the town continually has on these assumptions. Now, I don't know that it would be any different if it was a privately run facility owned by the town. We'd still have that problem of the Medicare, Medicaid reimbursements. And I don't know if that's anything you can address or you dare to address.
All I can say,
But I wanted to put it on the table.
with your Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements are extremely hard to predict 5 years down the road, even 2 or 3 years down the road. It's really
It's like predicting the number of children that will be in kindergarten 10 years out. They haven't been thought of yet, let alone born.
yeah.
Okay.
Medicaid, the state of Connecticut has had rate freezes for it will be 2 years that they have within their budget currently, but they have not projected beyond that what's going to happen. And then with Medicare, MedPAC makes their recommendations on rate increases every year, and then CMS interprets those, and then there's lobbyists from the long-term care arena that they go back and forth. So it's hard to predict, and with healthcare reform, you don't know what's going to happen, especially now after what happened last week in Massachusetts. So it's difficult to project. So what we did is try to look at the reasonableness of the assumptions based on our experience in 20 years, for me, it's been 20 years in the industry, and looking at how CMS does their annual rate increases and so forth, and just trying to apply my experience to these assumptions to determine whether we think they're reasonable.
When you looked at the benchmarks that you listed in the back, did you go back underneath those benchmarks to find out how, for example, benefits got so high in relation to the other towns that you compared us to, or did you just take what you were given and then take the average of the others?
We did not get into that level of detail. We looked at a high-level review of costs compared to benchmark to identify areas where there may be an opportunity. And the next step would be, that information's been provided, the next step would be for you to go through and do a deeper dive to see, is there anything in there that we can change to improve or to get us closer to the benchmark? In relation, the benefits, it's my experience that the benefits aren't too far out of the ballpark when you compare to other municipalities or state-run facilities.
Okay.
It's when you compare it to the private sector, the 20 to 25% is kind of your range that you see. And
were you, and I don't know if you were retained to look at the underlying business model? Was that part of their look at? What we're, with the community, with the combination that we have there now, and then we're renovating the facility in order to do those models of what we're doing at the facility?
That our scope was limited to the financial projections.
LRP and the financial
yes,
projections.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
And then Ms. Tarkington, but to address your point about where we are, as I've said before, I think this is the first step. Although I don't want to say the ship has sailed on some of the questions that you're asking in terms of where we're headed, but at some point, this body is going to be the first body that takes up Project Renew, and at some point we need to take that step forward. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a conversation about some of the things you raised, but we have an opportunity now to go over some of Project Renew, but we're still left with really 4 alternatives, and what you're suggesting in terms of at least the discussion talks about getting out of the business as a town. And I think sooner rather than later, that discussion, if you still want to have it, needs to happen immediately, because money's continued to be spent on Project Renew, and at some point, this board needs to either get behind Nathaniel Witherell or say, no, we're not going to fund it. And that's what today is the start of that discussion that hopefully is going to culminate in an application, at least by Nathaniel Witherell to the BET for funding. Right. So if we're, again, as a body, and I'm not suggesting that you're suggesting it, but as a body, if we decide that that's not where we want to be, whether it's based on this report or otherwise, we need to have that discussion immediately with Nathaniel Witherell.
I think that this report brings that matter up for discussion based on the revenues and the cash needs and other things, and I think we as a body need to either reaffirm that decision that that's what we want to do, or we look at what other alternatives do we have? I don't know if we have them. So, but I mean, that's something that we should discuss.
Fair point. Fair point. Ms. Tarkington.
Yes. The model of care that's going to be implemented, I guess, is what is requiring the increasing of the staffing by the 5 FTEs. Is that? And
some of it's based on square footage changes as well.
The increase of another 30% of square footage or so. And so in the facilities, other facilities that you're managing, are you seeing increases in labor like that? I mean, overall, Witherell today is one of the largest town departments, but it's about 8% of, more or less, of our total human resources. Are you, and we've been trying to manage those to the best we can, flat or obviously down to lower expenses. This would be, counter to this trend. But are you seeing increases in the facilities? I mean, there was an article in today's Greenwich Times that showed how other well, they were hospitals primarily, were reducing staff, but.
Yeah, there's been a number of models. Probably the last 5 to 7 years is where you've really seen the social model of care emerging, or neighborhood models, or there's 20 different names. But essentially, it does cost significantly more to go to a community model of care. It's more labor. It is labor intensive. It depends on really a deeper dive and looking at job function responsibilities, universal employees, and how they really exhibit. There's a number of facilities have lost their shirts going that route and having hospitals subsidizing them. And there have been some that have been more moderate, and we work with the full continuum. But aggressive individuals that have gone into significant labor increases have typically scaled back after 1 or 2 years because they can't afford, similar to the revenue. The revenue's not coming in to afford that big of an influx of staff.
Sort of continuing on with these costs, I think putting them in a band between 2 and 3.5%, or relating it to revenue, may be very difficult given that this is another town department, and again, only about 8% of our total staff within the town, although I know that Witherell does its best to contain these costs. Nevertheless, when we're looking at other things, later this evening we'll be looking at our pension fund and the inflation rate, and there we're using 3.5% for over the next 30 years. So, when the town has both GWI and step increases, and that's been sort of the nature of how we compensate our employees, it seems that it will be very difficult to keep it within this proposed band to link it to revenues. And I also want to comment on while labor is obviously some 75–80% of the expenses, the other expenses that you have here, again, inflation rates are between 2 and 3%. Again, based on other parallels that we're seeing, those numbers also may be low. And then sort of one final point, the expenses for keeping up the maintenance of the building, at 200,000 or whatever it's starting out at, seems low when the town has worked very hard to make sure that it's keeping its buildings in good order and updated. I mean, in years 1, 2, and 3, that may be reasonable, but as we move out here, this is a renewal of buildings, and there are a lot of things, windows that aren't being replaced, or laboratory fixtures, or whatever, that may require more expenses. So, again, your comment is consider them reasonable, but is such a small number relative to a facility that's going to be valued at $40 million or more a reasonable number, or does it relate more to the depreciable value of the building, some 3% or something like that? A lot of questions.
Yeah, when we reviewed, again, the inflation factors is really based on what we've seen in our experience with other facilities and in the market for healthcare, for skilled nursing facilities. A lot of times it's not the same as the overall inflation factor. And so, again, we can only give you our opinion based on our experience and the information that we gathered through our review. I'm not sure how to address the maintenance cost issue. I think that there were some changes that were incorporated into the LRP to account for changes in maintenance costs under a new facility, a renovated facility, compared to current. And I think those changes that was part of the increase in staff because of square footage or number of rooms, but there was also a corresponding decrease in repair costs because if you have a new facility, the assumption is you would have lower maintenance expense. So I hope that we've addressed that within the report. If not, we can certainly follow up and try to get an answer for you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think that overall the report has been very constructive and helpful in helping us look at some issues that we might not normally think of here in the town. So I do want to thank you for all the work you've done on it.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. before we go to him, so it appears that everyone has had an opportunity to speak, and I would just note that, Mr. Simon, note the time. And once again, I don't want to cut off conversation, especially if it's constructive for Nathaniel Witherell. I know Mr. Ormsby would like to speak, so we'll go around again just to see if there are any other questions or comments, and then we'll let Mr. Ormsby speak, and if there might be some follow-up questions then or comments, and then we'll try to wrap it up. So with that, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you. I'd like to take you back to the construction cost estimates, pages 6 and 7. You indicated your review suggested a construction cost slightly under $30 million, and that the proposal from Turner had come in at a cap of just under $37 million. And on the next page, you indicate where you see some of the differences. Did your construction cost estimate include contingency, but just at a much lower level?
Yes, it was a much lower level. It was based on the experience of our construction
But you
consultant.
go ahead and make the comment that part of the difference may be local conditions here. And I'm curious because a lot of that depends upon the timing of when these assessments were made, because we've certainly seen a lot of changes in construction costs over the last 3 to 4 years, first up and then down. Do you anticipate that this is, as best you can tell presently, fairly accurate, and you would expect that, again, your people feel that it could be done at substantially less cost?
That's what our people believe based on the information that was provided to them, and the scope of the project and the budget and other schedules that were given. I do have to stress that it was a high level review. They didn't go down into extreme detail on that in those costs, but that was their opinion that those costs were higher than what they would estimate, and they did make some adjustments for Greenwich.
Because when this project was originally conceived, it was conceived at a lower construction cost level, and then I think has increased over the period of time up to fairly recently.
Yeah, and I can't speak to the details of their analysis because that was not my expertise, but we do have some documents that were part of our review that have been provided that have a little more detail on the reason for those variances between Welsh and Turner, a little more explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Simon, and then Mr. Finger.
So I have one question on page 77, just to make sure I understand this. So in the scenario number 1, where you show a 3.5% increase, and it shows the impact on the 30-year cash flow is 0. This is because, and then the total cash needed is $44 million. So what is, if we used a 3.5% increase, do we know what the profit, what would be on page 74, the bottom line for net income, or the bottom line for cash flow? 75.
The total cash need on page 75 for scenario 1, a 3.5% increase, the total cash need would be $44.3 million.
Over the 30 years.
For the whole project, yes. Now, the reason why there's 0...
Be the cash flow.
I can get that number for you. The reason why there's a 0 in the impact on cash flow column is because that's the assumption that's currently in the LRP. But we're saying with all the other changes that we made, the total cash need for this project would be $44.3 million. I would have to go back and look at what the actual cash flow number is using that assumption in addition to all of our recommended changes.
Isn't it $38.5 million more in accordance with page 77?
Mr. Raymer, I'm just going to ask you, if there are a lot of people who want to speak right now, so we'll come back to you in a
So,
second.
so in the end, what I think we'd like to see is for these four scenarios, what is the ultimate profitability going to be? And what is the maximum cash flow, which you seem to have listed on page 77?
Yes. We can add more detail to this.
And I think that would then give everyone a sense of the best case and the worst case.
Okay. I can certainly add more detail.
Thank you.
Mr. Finger, and then we'll come back.
I want to follow up with some of the questions that Mrs. Tarkington had with regard to expenses, operating maintenance expenses. We're talking about a 30-year period. Granted, it's a new building, but you start moving out years 15, 20, 25. We have issues possibly of roof repairs, roof replacement, carpet replacement. Have those numbers been factored into the expense numbers in the LRP and in your numbers, as opposed to just purely facility, the operation standpoint, not the physical plant? Because obviously those are important expense numbers.
After the changes for the renovated facility in 2014 are incorporated, beyond that, it's purely an inflationary increase on cost.
So there's nothing that's factored in for in year whatever roof replacement?
No. No.
Well, but that's perhaps a misleading answer. There's something factored in for maintenance.
It's nothing above and beyond the level of expense that is in the financials from the time the facility is renovated on. We haven't made an adjustment 20 years down the road saying, or 15 years down the road saying that you'll have to increase expenses because the building's getting older. Is that?
Yeah, it's like, as speaking to the chair and other members of the board here, when we do our modeling and our projections, for example, if we rebuild a school, which we have done, in the 15-year capital plan, there are placeholders for various capital improvements because buildings get older and things need to be replaced, notwithstanding the fact that they've been maintained during the course of the year. I'd like to know that those numbers have been included in these projections, because if not, then I think they need to be included, because it doesn't give us a true, clear picture of what potential exposure might be to the town.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of speaks to the difficulty of projecting for such a long range, out beyond 5 to 7 years. Those are some of the things that are really somewhat difficult to measure. But we can try to address that as a follow-up.
I'm concerned about what the numbers are, but I'd like to know, maybe Ray or somebody can tell me, are those numbers factored in at all? Forget what they are, but are there placeholders for those types of numbers?
Bill, in each year, including the 2011 budget, we have about $300,000 in town capital to find the way that town capital is defined. We also have approximately $50,000 a year, and these are all factored by inflation as you go out for those capital items that the state will pick up as being capital. Those items under 10,000 and above 2,500 factored in there, along with the normal maintenance, which I know is over 200. I just don't have the number in front of me at the moment, but it's 300 plus 50 factored going forward in each of the years.
Okay.
And I think you can look at
Thanks,
page 57 and 58 is where that's included in our report, and that's something I did not remember.
Mr. Kelly.
Can I ask you, did you ever reach an ultimate opinion as to the viability of the long-range financial plan? I mean, I know you've made comments about it throughout the report, and you've made changes in assumptions. But I note that your final line is, due to the volatility of the industry and its regulatory climate, Medicare and Medicaid payment methodology in particular, the actual financial results could vary materially from the projections. But based on your experience and knowledge in the field and your review of this, do you have any ultimate opinion with respect to the long-range financial plan?
Well, I think at this point, my opinion is that if the changes that we've made hold true as far as reimbursement and salaries and benefits and other issues, that this project will work if you have access to $21.3 million to cover cash deficits and to fund debt service.
That's what I want to know.
I think that's our opinion at this point.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Raymer and then Mr. Pellegrino.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm done. Thank you.
When you submit the year-by-year financials, could you also be very clear on the assumptions, definitions, specifically cash flow, total cash needs, so that's spelled out and we're clear about it?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, Mr. Ormsby had asked to be recognized, and so maybe we can give him a mic, just so that people can hear you. It's not a mic, but I think you could put the mic in.
Have my back to everybody.
Fair enough.
Have I got the mic on? I want to begin, Mr. Chairman, by extending my thanks to you and to Peter Monarski for assuring that I and Lloyd Bankson, who chairs our Finance Committee of the board, were kept informed and involved in the development of HDG's report as it went along. I think we were helpful to them on a number of issues that are raised by the report. I think you and I agreed at the outset that the purpose of the report was not to produce a gotcha list, and I think the final report is thoughtful and reflects a number of very useful observations and recommendations. I would be remiss this evening if I did not report to you publicly that just under 30% of Nathaniel Witherell's workforce is of Haitian origin. This has been an extraordinary stressful week or 10 days really for many of them. They have nevertheless performed their daily tasks with the devotion and the competence and dignity that and loyalty that we expect and receive from them every day. So our town should be proud of them. As I have said to some of you before, the only thing that can be said with certainty about a projection of 30 years of financial results is that they are wrong. Therefore, I derive considerable comfort from the fact that the full HDG report identifies no fewer than 28 instances where our assumptions are described either as reasonable or conservative. We do take issue with the conclusion, which the full slide presentation describes as an error on our part in our assumption of a 96% census in 2015, the first full year after completion of Project Renew. We do not believe it's erroneous to assume that the excitement and the buzz associated with a fully refurbished Nathaniel Witherell will result in a 2% increase in the census from the 94% level which was assumed during the construction period. I would remind HDG and everybody here that in 3 of the last 7 years, the Nathaniel Witherell has operated with a census which exceeds 97%. The largest negative change made by HDG to our long-range projections is a $25.4 million reduction in our assumed Medicare A revenues. I don't know whether it would be helpful to put slide 75 back there on the screen for just a moment, because I want to talk about two major difficulties we have with the projections. That's it. Our Medicare A revenues are primarily associated with our short-term rehab activities. This 25.4 reduction is said to be based at several points in the report on, quote, expected cuts contained in pending health care reform legislation. And I think, as Tom mentioned, that assumption, it seems to us, is become problematic since last Tuesday's election by Massachusetts of a Republican senator. And whether these cuts and indeed the existence of reform legislation at all continues to be a realistic assumption is, in our judgment, open to question. Reduction in Medicare revenues of the magnitude suggested by HDG doesn't just affect Nathaniel Witherell. It effectively denies adequate reimbursement to nursing homes throughout the United States at a time when our elderly population is growing dramatically. It simply doesn't strike us as a likely scenario to unfold. The next largest adjustment to our long-range projections is the approximately $10 million in salary and fringe benefits that are associated with an assumed increase in our staffing model, particularly our proposed person-centered care environment when it is finally rolled out. This staffing model continues to be a work in progress. We make substantial use of part-time employees at Nathaniel Witherell, and about 44% of the 280 employees at Nathaniel Witherell are part-timers who are not eligible for fringe benefits. We have visited nursing facilities of our size which have implemented person-centered care models with no increase in staffing, and we continue to study this staffing issue. I would ask you to remember that this current board of directors reduced our authorized full-time employees from 173 in 2005 to our current level of 156. And we are equally committed to right-sizing person-centered care. Slide 75, which is up there, shows you HDG's bottom line conclusion that over the 30 years of financial projections, our revenues will be $21.3 million short of the financing requirements for Project Renew. That's that number which appears in the lower right-hand corner that Tom has addressed earlier. If only half the proposed HDG reduction of $25.4 million in Medicare revenues were eliminated or were to materialize, and if our person-centered care staffing model can be implemented without an increase from current staffing levels, or possibly through a judicious use of part-time employees, the entire $23.1 million shortfall shown there would be eliminated. We currently have under study the possible qualification of Project Renew for historic income tax credits, which may be available for sale to third parties. HDG has eliminated, as you see in the second line on slide 75, the $12.3 million contribution from the private fundraising efforts we have undertaken to commence. And finally, I would ask you to remember that the current board and the senior staff of Nathaniel Witherell has operated this institution without cost to the town of Greenwich and its taxpayers for 2.5 full years now. We've accomplished this notwithstanding a $6 million loss attributable to the state's failure to reimburse us for the full cost of caring for our Medicaid residents during that same 2.5-year period. We've accomplished this result by relentless attention to expenses and the identification of new revenue sources. We would expect to bring the same financial discipline to the achievement of our long-range financial projections. In fact, our actual revenues for the 6-month ended December 31, 2009 were ahead of our long-range projections by more than $111,000. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ormsby. I want to conclude by just thanking, as I did before, not only Nathaniel Witherell Board, but HDG. I think this report clearly sets on the table, at the very least, discussion points, and I'm sure we can debate the pros and cons of many of the assumptions in there, but certainly it puts right in front of us, front and center, this important project for the town. So I want to thank you for the work and the accommodations that were made, the various conference calls and the like, meeting with not only Turner but Nathaniel Witherell and their staff. So I think from here we'll set out a process jointly with Nathaniel Witherell. We'll look forward to your final report. I think certainly I jotted down some of the information that is still being requested. It'll all funnel through Peter Mynarski, our Comptroller. And we'll look for that final report in the coming weeks. That way, my sense is, and I think there still needs to be a conversation about whether or not Project Renew fits in the budget process. And I'm not sure we want to tie our hands by putting it in that without having the proper debate. So we can talk about that as a town, and then ultimately get out there and move Project Renew forward, or not, if that's the direction it goes. But and then I think it becomes a joint effort to try to take it to the last bus stop, which is the RTM. So unless there are any other questions, thank everyone for coming. It's nice to see so many people in the audience. Usually there's only a handful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Nice job.
Very good. Interesting. I mean, the bottom line is, you can see the writing on the wall.
Unless anyone wants to take a break at this time, we'll go right into it.
Let's go.
Okay. Item 3 now comes before us, consideration of applications. For that, we have 5 routine applications before us. For that, I call on our clerk, Mr. Pellegrino.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I move ED7, Board of Ed, approval to use $4,880 for audio-video equipment. SE7, from the First Selectman, an additional appropriation of $39,188 for a judgment. PD2, from the Police Department, which would be the acceptance of forfeiture assets. PW4 from the Department of Public Works for additional appropriation of $45,000 for the Shore Road Bridge Rehab Project. And finally, PW5, also from the Department of Public Works, an additional appropriation of $1,458,700 $764 for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act pavement restoration.
It's been moved by Mr. Pellegrino,
Second.
second by Mr. Mason. Discussion. Mr. Mason.
I'd just like to make 3 quick comments. These obviously went through the Budget Committee tonight. The first one, the ED7, there'll be a resolution in next year's budget. This is equal to our Channel 79, so we'll be able to do that next year without having them to come before us. PD2 was equipment. One actually was a vehicle, and some good conversations with the police department on whether to keep the vehicle or not because of its age. And PW5 was part of the stimulus package, so that'll have an impact on our increasing our blacktopping in this current year and will allow us to work modifying the budget a little bit for next year. So we're thankful for that. Thank you.
Further discussion on these items, Mr. Kelly.
Can you just tell me, I assume that's a judgment, SE7, 39,000?
Yes.
Was there an offer and demand that was discussed at any time?
Mr. Mason.
If I may, that's an actual settlement from the court. It's judgment. It's a judgment from the court. We.
No, I know. Was there an offer and demand before I assume it went to trial?
Mr. Kelly, the Law Committee looked at this on more than one occasion over a long period of time. There were settlement negotiations. They, in the end, were not fruitful. And so we have the judgment that was rendered against the town in this amount in this case.
Can you pass
I think if we wanted any further discussion, we may need to.
No, you can just pass me a note, what the demand and offers were.
Okay.
Thank you.
Further discussion. I'd like to note at this time, too, that Ms. Barton and Mr. Norton had prior commitments for tonight's meeting, and therefore it's the 10 of us. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 10-0-0. Item 4 now comes before us, the assessor's report. Before the assessor gives his report, is there a motion to take the first item under old business up at this point to take it up in tandem with the assessor's report? Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Second by Mr. Raymer. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? 10-0-0. Okay. Good evening, Mr. Gwartney. Why don't you first give your report, and then if we'll first take a vote on the report, and then we'll come to the senior tax credit letter thereafter.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. You have my report in front of you. The important news is that the grand list has been completed. There's a growth in this year's grand list of 0.69%, which is less than it had been in some prior years, but still it is some growth for the helping the budget. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Questions for the assessor, Mr. Simon?
In the revaluation, I noticed that the number of cars went down slightly. The value of this because people stopped buying cars.
Yes, the number of cars has decreased. There has not been as much replacement of vehicles and holding of vehicles. Yes. It's common throughout the state. It's not unique to Greenwich.
Any further questions, Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, Mr. Gwartney. In our budget committee meeting, as you can tell from the applications, the police department came and bought a vehicle and valued it using Blue Book, but that's not the methodology your department uses. It uses a different company, NADA or something, NADA. Not necessarily tonight, but at some point, maybe next month's report, can you just, or tonight if you know, give us a little information on the differences, using two different methodologies for valuing vehicles?
The state assessors have surveyed the different methods, and they decided that NADA was the better source to use for valuing motor vehicles. So it is used statewide. Assessors do have some flexibility but the assessors generally all use the NADA publication.
Thank you.
Further questions? Is there a motion to approve the assessors report?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Mason. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions 10-0-0. Mr. Courtney, if you now can give a brief overview of the senior tax relief letter and documentation.
What we tried to do is to produce a letter that would cover all aspects, and the way that the ordinance was amended, it was amended so that the same requirements would apply to both the tax deferral and the tax credit programs. So our letter is following the same example, explaining what the basically requirements are and what needs to be done in terms of application and the deadlines that people have to accomplish it. And basically the second sheet we have is an information sheet that talks about the tax credit program first, the tax deferral program second, and then third, the requirements for both of the programs. And then fourth, the filing period of time, and then the documentation necessary to be produced to acquire either one of the two programs. And then finally, the application itself is the same as prior years with some minor modifications that make it just easier to understand and to produce. So basically, those are the three primary documents that the office is using, and there's been a lot of input from various BET members already, which I appreciate, that we've tried to incorporate into these three documents. And if there's other suggestions, I would welcome those. We are planning on mailing out the forms at the end of this week, so if there's any additional changes, I really need to know tomorrow.
I think it was a useful suggestion to have this process. I know I saw many of the suggested changes and the inquiries from BET members, so I'm glad, Mr. Simon, that you raised this as an issue last month. And so I think it was a good process. I see now that there are two more suggestions. And I also like to note the attendance of the tax collector. Mr. Ladonia, welcome. Since we are voting on this, let me put forward these two, and if there are others, before I do that, are there any others suggested changes to any three of these documents? Mr. Kelly.
I just have a question. Do we define the applicant anywhere on these two sheets? I see we have two names up at top below the parcel, and then I see we talk about the applicant throughout it. For example, the applicant is a resident of the town of Greenwich at the time of application. I assume that would apply to both of those people, the names up above? I just think maybe I don't want to change a form, but maybe a parentheses applicant. You know, I don't see anywhere here where we define who the applicant is.
These names are supposed to be the owner's name.
Yes.
So if you want to change it to add the word owner, you can do that. But it's pretty self-evident.
I'm just, there's seniors who are doing this. And some of them are more senior than others. And that's just a thought. I'm throwing it out there.
Is that a cause for confusion?
I mean, we could say applicant owner, or we could say owner.
Steve, I don't want to go down this road. I really don't. I just thought it was maybe next year. We'll see how it works this year.
Well, why don't? Okay, you have that. We're not going to change that aspect of it, but you've heard the comment, and whether or not you change the top portion of page 3 where it says name to applicant or applicant owner, we'll leave it up to your discretion to make that decision, at least this time, and then if there is an issue, report back if you've had any issue with that. But So are there any other changes then, requests for modification? All right, on the second document, the information page, under the heading of tax deferral, in the bold, in the bold, instead of you can only apply, you may only apply.
May,
May as instead of
Instead
in
of
replace
can.
of can.
good.
And at the very bottom, where documents provided will not be open to public inspection and will be, and instead of held strictly confidential, will be kept confidential.
Kept or strictly confidential, I can do it either way.
Strike held and strictly and replace it with kept.
And that matches what you wrote
Okay.
in the other letter.
Is there any objection to those two modifications?
No. For me.
Okay.
All right, all those in favor of, I'm sorry, is there a motion to approve the letter and its relevant corresponding documents? Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Mason. Further discussion, as amended? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 10-0-0. Thank you very much. Bob Shipman, thank you for coming as well.
I made the motion.
Item 5 now comes before us. BET Committee and Special Project Team reports. Audit Committee, Investment Committee, Nathaniel Witherell, Building Committee, Human Resources Committee reports. Thank you all for filing or submitting these written reports. Obviously, our committee's changed, and there are new members to many of these committees, so these are their first reports. And I was pleased with the reports as they came out. Any questions on those reports? Moving along to the item 6 now is before us, the Comptroller's report. Mr. Mynarski, our
Good evening,
Comptroller.
Mr. Chairman, BET members. We did go to market January 21st, last Thursday. It was very successful. On the bands, we got a rate of 28 basis points, and if you remember, 1 year prior, we got 38 basis points, which I believe, I don't have statistics to back it up, sets a record in the state. And then the 25-year note, I'm sorry, the $45 million 5-year note produced a interest rate of 1.84. That's a blended rate. It has a combination of $39 million of general fund money amortized over 5 years, and it's got about $6 million of sewers in there amortized over 20 years. So it's the two together blended came out with a 1.84%. And we did go to 3 of the rating agencies and did get AAAs from all 3. I'll answer any other questions, anything else contained in the Comptroller's report.
Mr. Simon and then Ms. Tarkington.
Do you know what the 5-year rate was?
You didn't get the email right. We're in the process, we've requested that for purposes of accounting because the interest amortization has to be charged to the general fund and the sewer amortization has to be charged to the sewer improvement fund. We did not get that back from the IBIC. They're in the process of doing 3 issuances this week, so we did request it, and the answer is I don't have it today, but we need it internally.
Mr.
Then one other question. Do you expect the retirement board to make a decision on Thursday?
On
Consulting?
the RFPs?
Yes?
Definitely not. What's going to happen is there's 10 respondents. I'm one of the raters, and we are simply going to turn in our sheets. I think a few of you are familiar with the process through purchasing. If you've done RFPs for actuary or accountant or any of the other ones, the 5 raters in this case rank the respondents individually, don't have the ability to speak to each other. And what's going to happen Thursday is we're going to show up and turn in our 10 sheets and then proceed from there as far as scheduling, making the list of 10 down to a shorter list of 2 to 4 maybe.
You're turning your 5 sheets.
Excuse me?
Never mind.
10, there's 10 responses, 50 sheets.
Seriously? Okay.
On that one topic, though, I just want to stay with that for a second. I would like you to formally request of the retirement board, however, copies of all 10 proposals to be provided to our liaisons. I think it's absolutely critical that our 2 liaisons understand the proposals, that they, even if they're not, I won't go so far as to suggest that they should be graders or scorers in that process, but it's absolutely critical that as this body, which is going to ultimately have to sign off on a contract, that it behooves the retirement board that we be involved in the process to the extent, to the highest extent possible. And so I would ask if you could formally request that our 2 liaisons be provided with copies so that they can be as engaged as possible in that debate.
Agreed, yes.
Ms. Tarkington first, and then Mr. Huffman.
I was just going to actually ask for the coupon rates for all, both the short-term, all the tranches, both tranches of the longer term also. So if you can just provide all that information, that'd be super.
I will forward that through an email to the whole BE team.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that we don't get the bid forms that show the scale when they receive the bids.
I have them. We don't.
You've gotten those, then those would show what the rates for each of the maturities are.
I wasn't aware that I had to bring it to the meeting tonight, but they're available.
It was just a question of whether you actually had those already.
Yes.
Okay, so we know what they are.
Further discussion. Is there a motion to approve the Comptroller's report?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Raymer. Mr. Raymer, second by Mr. Simon. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention 900. Mr. Mason had to step out for a business trip. Soon we'll have none. I must admit, usually it's at this point that Mr. Crumick has some comment. I'm still waiting for it to come out. I haven't heard it. Somebody's going to have to pick up the slack on that. Do I have a motion to accept the treasurer's report? Moved by Mr. Fingers, second by Mr. Simon.
I have one comment on treasurers.
Mr. Simon.
So if you look, what I noticed here, when I looked at the OPEB, that showed for the year to date, we've generated 14.7% rate of return. And if you look at the flash report for the retirement fund, they've generated 13 point, it's hard for me to read that. Yeah. Put my glasses on.
That's 13.5.
13.5, but the OPEB with its less expensive investment mechanism is doing quite well. But we have a different asset mix, but still makes you wonder sometimes. But that's my only comment.
Other comments on the treasurer's report? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention 900. Do I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes for December 21st, 2009?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Simon. Second by Mr. Raymer. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention 900.
You have to have 2 abstentions.
I take it, Mr. Huffman, you're abstaining? And Mr. Pellegrino?
Even though they didn't know they were.
702.
Okay.
There was well, I won't get into it about whether or not we accept or just simply approve these minutes, but that's fine. 702. Do I have a motion to approve the January 4th meeting?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Simon, second by Ms. Tarkington. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against, abstentions, 1, 801. Mr. Finger abstains as he was not present. Item now comes before us, officers' report, unless Mr. Campbell or Mr. Pellegrino have anything. I will simply say that I've had the opportunity to meet with the Riverside Association. I spoke before that group. Now starts the real heavy lifting when it comes to public education in terms of where we are. As many of you have heard me say numerous times, and I try earnestly to live by this and be consistent, and that is that I don't believe that I speak on behalf of the BET when it comes to decisions that have yet to be made by the BET. So when people ask me, what does the BET's opinion say on the Greenwich High School auditorium or even the Central Fire Station, I am very careful to indicate that those two projects are not yet before us, and that in fact we will get the opportunity to review those two projects if and when they come before us through the First Selectman's consolidated budget. But clearly, that's where most of the email traffic is coming from. For those of you new to the board, you will know that I will, through Elaine, forward all of the emails that I receive. Right now, the Greenwich High School auditorium is in the lead. I suspect it'll stay there. And I will forward to you the emails from the various constituencies. Right now, they're mostly directed to the First Selectman with a copy to me, but I will still nonetheless forward them to you. But we'll try to bundle them and then get them out so that you'll have a full set. Tomorrow night is the CIP Committee's public hearing at 7 o'clock here in the Town Hall meeting room. I encourage you all to attend. It is important to get to understand where the public is on many of these major capital projects and not so major capital projects. As everyone knows, the First Selectman will present his consolidated budget on February 8th. But a question for the Finance Department. Roland, when do you expect, though, that under at least our policy, I'm not sure it's the one in the charter revision, but under our policy, the First Selectman is supposed to present the consolidated budget by February 1st. Is that still, are we on track for that?
We are. The selectman wanted to submit the budget along with his message. He felt that last year the budget went out and then the message followed and people were only drawing their own conclusions and didn't listen to what he really was saying as much in the budget message as he'd like to. So he hoped to get it done by the 3rd of February.
By the 3rd? And give that to you for the 3rd for just to start replicating it?
We'll get it to you Thursday if he gets that to us.
At the 4th, that gives us 3 days.
Well, and the first presentation isn't until the Board of Ed, which is that Wednesday.
First hearings are not until the Board of Ed.
Right, and then you have the following week before you get into the budget deliberations.
Right.
We should work on this, though. We should work on the timing of the message and the actual budget. Maybe we have to revise our schedule as to when that presentation is actually made. But that's part of the postmortem that.
Well, that was sort of based on having it done by the 1st. So a week was enough time.
Right. So we can look into that.
Should we make a request that the message be less than 35 pages?
You could.
I'll make that request through you.
All right. That's all I have for my report, except to say that the requests for information continue to come in relative either to the budget or just to where we stand in terms of financing both capital and operating expenses. And to the extent that information is needed for everyone here to deliberate the upcoming budget, I will surely pass that information along. And lastly, I have at least a preliminary draft to our Vice Chairman to discuss topics not only for this year's budget deliberations, but also for our what I call is our 2-year term. And again, optimistic that we're going to place a lot of these topics within standing committees. And I am hopeful this year, then I anticipate that the vice chairman will be in charge of shepherding those projects through. That said, item 10 now comes before us. We've already taken care of the first item under item 10, old business. Now before us is the approval of the Retirement Board actuarial assumptions for fiscal year 10-11 to 2012-2013. First, why don't we just get it on the before us? Is there a motion to approve these assumptions?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Simon, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Just so that everyone can recall, this is an item that came before us last month, and it was indicated that we needed a little bit more time in terms of looking at these assumptions, and so therefore it is now before us for a vote. Discussion. Mr. Simon.
Yeah, the last 3.5% has a colon. It should just be a period on the bottom of the page.
Under the further resolved, if everyone sees that on the last line. Is there any objection to that? Okay. Any other further discussion? I would just note then, for the record, for those either watching on Channel 79 or here with us, very few of you, that a lot of deliberation went into this. I'd like to thank Joe Pellegrino at least for performing some analysis on this and walking through the assumptions. As I think I said on WGCH at the end of our last, or after our meeting last month, these assumptions are critical to determine how much we fund our retirement fund every year, and going on a go-forward basis will be impacting how much we're going to be allocating to our retirement fund. A lot of work went into these assumptions. I'm thankful for the Retirement Board to take them up and then present them to us and for us to take them up. I think long-term, it's always been a goal of ours to reduce especially the discount rate. We're doing that. And I think many of these, if not all of them, are prudent financial policies, and in their totality make it a better system. I'm very much anticipating that we're going to be able to hit these marks over the long haul, and that's the goal, is to not make adjustments on an ad hoc or year-to-year basis, but to have longevity with these assumptions. And I think the time of 1 month was well spent in terms of getting everybody comfortable with where we are with this. So with that, is there all those in favor of the assumption signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 900. Item 11 now comes before us, approval of the actual aerial report for OPEB. Is there a motion, first to get it on the table, motion to approve that report?
Second.
Moved by Mr. Simon, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion. Just briefly, as all of you know, I am extremely optimistic that the OPEB ad hoc committee will be able to wrap up their work in the coming months, and we can move on in terms of having simply a board of trustees who then reports to an arm of the BET, and then figuring out exactly the process in terms of approving reports and committees that are recommending reports and trustees. And so we look forward to that. In all likelihood, though, not until after the budget process.
But you're going to reassign this type of a project to a committee?
That's correct.
Budget committee or the investment committee?
At some point in time, by next year certainly, but the goal of the ad hoc committee is to help tie up all of the loose ends, make recommendations to this body for us to vote on, so that we have a policy going forward in terms of how we manage OPEB, both from an investment standpoint and from a organizational or working relationship standpoint.
But so we're going to meet with them again this summer, so sooner than later. Okay.
All those in favor of approval of the report for OPEB signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 900. Thank you all. Is there any other business that comes before us? Motion to adjourn. Thank you.